Welcome to LG Ministry. We really appreciate you watching our program. In this series, we're going to be taking a close look at the Book of James. It's going to be fairly in-depth, and at times we will stick right to the verse, but other times we'll break off and talk about the topics that are mentioned within the Book of James. So I hope you learn a lot from this series and you get a lot out of it. In our last lesson, we began talking about the tongue. In this lesson, we're going to continue on from where we left off. One of the main points we covered so far was how a person's heart would eventually make its way to the tongue, which is why it's so important to make sure that our hearts are pure. When our hearts are pure and we do our best to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, we're going to be slow to speak. And even when we do speak, it's going to be with well-chosen words. We also talked about several ways the tongue can be used for evil or for good. So we're going to continue examining the ways the tongue can be used and how we as Christians should be using our tongues. Our first point has to do with critical words. This could include griping and complaining or always having negative things to say about someone or something. I really believe that some Christians don't realize how critical they have become because everything starts out small until they have grown into the monster that they are today. They have slowly conditioned themselves to have critical thinking and critical words so that being critical is part of their everyday lives. And they cannot see why they have turned into such a beast. A great story that illustrates what I'm talking about comes from a murder mystery. There was a man who wanted to kill his wife. He wanted to do it in such a way that he wouldn't get caught. He decided to poison his wife. So this is what he did. For months, he gave himself small doses of the poison so that his body would begin to get used to it and he would be able to handle the poison without it killing him. Then he put the poison in their food that night, and his wife died while he suffered no ill effects because his body had built up a resistance to the poison. Now, at first, they ruled him out as a suspect since he ate some food. But by the end of the movie, they finally figured out what he had done. And the whole point behind this story is that just as this man conditioned his body to get used to the poison, we can do the same thing when we use poisonous words more and more each day. We become numb to those things that we say, and we hear them all the time, so we just become accustomed to it. Many of us today are not shocked, nor do we even pay attention whenever there are curse words that are said on TV or movies, because every day we hear someone either on TV, in person, or sometimes even in commercials where people are using curse words. And so we get to the point where we simply ignore them. Thanks to all of these reality shows we have, many have discovered just how critical and grouchy they are because they get to see themselves in action and they don't like what they see. I have seen some of these people call themselves monsters, and they would begin to break down and cry because for the first time, they got to see just how horrible they are and how horrible they treated others. I think some of us might be horrified if we had our lives filmed all the time, and then we were able to watch one of those situations when we allowed our emotions to get the best of us and we allowed ourselves to fly off the handle for no reason. I don't know of anyone who likes to be around a person very long who is full of criticism because it's a type of torture. In fact, one person I read about said that continual criticism is like undergoing water torture where the water is dropped on your forehead over and over again. Critical words can destroy relationships and it can wreak havoc on people's self-esteem. But the question becomes, how can we recognize if we're being critical in our lives? Well, I would tell you it is not an easy task, but it can be done. It will take help from God, from you, and from those around you. Notice what James says, James 1 verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. Here's the best place to start. I believe that we should all pray for wisdom, especially in the area of how to deal with people. We should ask God to open up our eyes to the way that we treat others and make sure that we're using the right words instead of the wrong ones. We should be humble enough to ask God to help us recognize our weaknesses and to have the wisdom to make ourselves stronger in these areas. Next, I would suggest that we must be willing to test ourselves and try and view our behavior from another perspective. On any given day, we need to make a conscious decision to evaluate what we are saying to others and then evaluate if what we are saying is negative or positive. To the best of our abilities, we need to try and figure out the impact of our words, or we might consider how we would take it if someone used our words against us. If we really pay attention and evaluate how we are using our tongues on any given day, I think some of us might be shocked at some of the things that we say and do. We must be willing to try and change our ways and stop being so critical. Life is too short to live a life full of negativity. Another tool we can use is our children or our grandchildren, because they are like little recorders and they will mimic you and say some of the same critical words that you use to others. Listen to your children's words carefully, and if you see a negative attitude or you see them griping and complaining about stuff, they probably learned it from you, which means you need to examine yourself closely. We need to remember what Paul wrote in Ephesians 6 and verse number 4. And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. If we are constantly bashing our children with negative words and complaining, then it's going to stir up anger in them, and it's going to be difficult for us to train them in the way of the Lord. A good question to ask yourself is this: am I criticizing my children more than I am encouraging them? We need to be careful of how we treat our children, because if we continue to criticize them all the time, they will start to look down on themselves and will most likely have low self-esteem. It's up to us to break the cycle that we learn from our parents or from someone else so that those critical words will stop with us. Another tool that can be used to help us to see our critical behavior is the help of our loved ones letting us know how critical we are to others. A great example of this has to do with the children of Israel as they escaped from their Egyptian bondage. As soon as they crossed the Red Sea, they began to gripe and complain about everything. And even Moses got to the point where he prayed to God for him to take his life so that he wouldn't have to listen to their complaining anymore. Well, God stepped in several times and punished the children of Israel for their criticism. Now, granted, this was God that intervened and showed these people that they were griping and complaining too much. But this same thing can be done for us today by our loved ones. When we see that our friends or our loved ones are being negative all the time, it's important that we talk to them and let them know how negative they're being, or else, they may never know. I can't tell you how many times people who are critical never recognize that they were being critical all the time until someone shed some light on the subject and let them know. Now, that person may get mad at first. That's true. But if that person is a Christian who really cares about the example he is being, then he should take your instruction to heart. Proverbs 10, verse 17, he who keeps instruction is in the way of life, but he who refuses correction goes astray. I also want to point out that there is good criticism and bad criticism. So far, we've been focusing on bad criticism and how it can tear people down. But now let's talk about using the tongue for good, constructive criticism. Giving criticism is never easy, because no matter how hard you try, sometimes people are going to have their feelings get hurt. But we must understand that constructive criticism helps us grow and become better than we were before. We'll talk more about how to receive criticism in a minute, but for now, let's talk about how we should give criticism. I found a couple of quotes that will help us. Criticism, like rain, should be gentle enough to nourish a man's growth without destroying his roots. Frank A. Clark. Do not remove a fly from your friend's forehead with a hatchet. That's a Chinese proverb. The first thing I would suggest is that you learn not to criticize someone for everything that they do wrong. The first thing I would suggest is that you learn not to criticize someone for everything they do wrong. Instead, learn to pick your battles and just focus on those things that are really important. Sometimes people will criticize others without having all the facts, and so we need to know everything we can about any given situation before we offer our criticism. If we only hear part of the story, we can end up criticizing something that doesn't need it, because if we knew the rest of the story, we would understand why the person said or did that partial thing that we're jumping to conclusions about. This goes right back to what James is telling us to do, and that is to be quick to listen. Another thing we can do is learn from our master teacher, Jesus. When he was speaking to the 7 churches in the Book of Revelation, if there was something good about the church, he started out with praise, and then he would tell them their faults and the changes that they needed to make. Paul did this same thing when he went to Athens. Instead of jumping on their case about all the idols they worshiped, he chose to point out that they were religious people, and then he used one of their idols, which was dedicated to the unknown God, to teach them about the only true God. In fact, let's look at those verses. Acts 17, verse 22. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you." So when you give criticism, make sure you always include those things that they're doing well. This way, they will know that you're not just trying to belittle them. One thing that comes to mind is a young child who is told to clean his room. Maybe he does a decent job on most of the room, but he gets a little lazy and throws a bunch of stuff in the corner. Now you could go in there, inspect his room, and say, "This room isn't clean. Look at that mess in the corner." However, that would just be pointing out the bad without acknowledging the good. If we follow the principle of Jesus and Paul, we might say this instead: "Well, you've done a really good job in most of your room. However, that one corner over there needs some work. You need to put that stuff in the corner away, and then you'll be done." It shouldn't take you that long, because, you're already got most of your room clean. It looks pretty good. Now, if you begin to tell someone this, you tell that kid that, again, they're going to realize that you're praising them for what they've done good, and then they're going to realize that, yes, they need to take that laziness right out of their bones and get over there and pick up the rest of that, and then they'll be done. And so this is something that will allow them to have a positive message, but also they're also receiving a negative message in that as well. So I would encourage you to try this next time you want to give someone constructive criticism. I think you'll find that it will help your constructive criticism be listened to more, and you'll see people not get offended as bad. Another thing we should avoid is absolutes when we give constructive criticism. In other words, don't say "you always" or "you never," "do this" or that. Statements like these are overstated. It's important that we learn better ways to give our criticism. We might do it in the form of a question like, "What do you think about doing it this way?" Or we might say something like, "Now, I could be wrong, but from my experience, this way or that way is a better way to do this." Now let's talk about taking criticism. Please notice the following quote: "The trouble with most of us is that we would rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism." Most of us would rather not hear criticism, but we need to realize that it will benefit us and make us stronger and better. Let's look at a few ways that we should take criticism as Christians, even if it's bad criticism. The first thing we need to do is listen. We will never be able to find out if a person is offering us good or bad criticism unless we hear them out. The mistake we make sometimes is jumping to conclusions, because before the person can get the second sentence out of their mouths, we get defensive and we interrupt them and we argue with them about the first sentence. So it's important that we take time to consider what has been said, as James has taught in our key verse. "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." Even when someone says something that doesn't sound right to us, there still may be some truth to it. As I've said before, sometimes it will help if we will restate what they said in our own words to see if we really understand what they're saying. We must also learn not to retaliate. In fact, sometimes the best response to negative criticism is by saying, "Thank you for your opinion. I'll think about that." Or as Jesus did many times, silence is sometimes the best answer. Now, if you're getting good advice, you certainly should be thankful for it, even if it might sting a little. I can tell you right now, we are all works in progress, and we can all do things better than we do them right now. So don't view constructive criticism as a bad thing. View it as a chance to grow. I want to share several verses from the Book of Proverbs that show the benefits of choosing your words wisely. Proverbs 10, verse 19, "In the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." Proverbs 13, verse 3, "He who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction." Proverbs 15, verse 23, "A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is." Proverbs 17, verse 27, "He who has knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of a calm spirit. Even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace. When he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive." Based on these passages, we learn that a few well-spoken words are much better than an overflowing mouth. A person that is just dying to talk all the time will usually end up saying things and sharing things they wish they had never said. So we must be careful that while our tongues are in drive, that our brains are not in neutral. Now, when someone sins against us, either by word or deed, Jesus explains to us how we are to handle that situation in Matthew 18, verse number 15. "Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector." If your brother or sister sins against you with their tongues, then Jesus says we are to go to that person alone and try to resolve the issue. However, this does not always happen because some will take those sinful words and will go tell everyone else about them without even trying to talk to that person who committed the sin. One wrong does not justify us to bypass Jesus' way. So let's always strive to go to that person first, and if they will not listen, then bring along a witness or two. And if you still can't resolve the issue, then bring it before the church. This is the proper way we should deal with a situation like this. Our next point comes from Colossians 4, verse number 6. "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." For us to really appreciate what Paul is saying here, we need to understand just how important salt was during the first century. It was so highly valued that people would trade gold for it. The Roman soldiers of that day even received an allowance for salt money. According to one author, the first trade routes between Egypt and Greece were built for the purpose of transporting salt. As you can see, salt was highly valued, and it has the following characteristics. First of all, salt saves. In the first century, they didn't have refrigerators, so they used salt to preserve their meat and fish. In a similar manner, we must learn to use our words wisely so that it might bring about salvation in someone's life. Salt flavors. Notice Job's question in Job 6, verse 6. "Can flavorless food be eaten without salt?" This is one of the nice things about salt, because if your food is kind of bland, you can add some salt to it and make it taste better. Again, this is the same concept we should be using with our words. Our words should be wholesome and easy to swallow instead of harsh and mean. Jesus warns about the danger of us losing our flavorful influence in Matthew 5, verse 13. "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned?" Salt also cleanses, as in the days of Elisha, where he threw salt into the Jericho spring to cleanse it. 2 Kings 2, verse 20, "And he said, Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it. So they brought it to him. Then he went out to the source of the water and cast in the salt there, and said, Thus says the Lord, I have healed this water. From it there shall be no more death or barrenness. So the water remains healed to this day, according to the word of Elisha, which he spoke. In a similar manner, we are to make sure that our words are clean and that we only speak those words which are befitting a child of God. All of these thoughts show us a much deeper meaning of what Paul meant when he tells us to season our words with salt. Peter also tells us something similar, 1 Peter 3, verse 15. But sanctify the Lord your God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks your reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Notice, our response to others is to be done with meekness and fear. If we can learn to season our words this way, then we will have a much better chance of reaching those around us. There are many more things we could look at regarding the use of the tongue, such as using encouraging words, teaching, or talking to the lost. But I hope you have found what I've said about the tongue helpful, and that you will be encouraged to use your tongue wisely instead of foolishly. I want you to think about this funny quote. The reason a dog has so many friends is because it wags its tail more than it does its tongue. One last time, let's look at what James said, James 1:19. So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God.